Hi there, welcome to the show. I'm here with regular guests Ian Brodie and Eugene Lang, pound for pound, the best political panel in Canada. I think, guys, we should take this on the road. That's apparently how you monetize these things nowadays.
Right.
What do you say? I think we would need a name though. We would need a band name. So
We'd sell at Massey Hall. That's good.
Following the footsteps of
more like Union
Rush,
Station in the
sort of
basement.
More
and
like
how about we be the tragically hip replacements? There you go.
Yeah.
the tragic hits.
So let me make a suggestion, see if either of you salute this. We appear to be facing a rare moment of calm in the kind of tempestuous seas of the last year. Arguably, and you could argue with me on this, but I think that after Mark Carney's speech in Davos, it has emerged in the mind of many people that he is the man to lead Canada, especially when the top tier issues are trade and defence. And even polls in Alberta, which Ian, you might want to speak to this, but the Conservatives were barely ahead in one of the polls that I saw. And it seems that in urban Alberta in particular, the Liberals are doing particularly well. Yet there are built-up expectations, and it seems to me many of them are unsustainable when you're talking about things like housing, deals with the provinces, economic development. So inevitably there is trouble ahead, which brings us to the point of endless speculation about a spring election and whether Mark Carney would contrive an election to take advantage of that mood. Does anybody see a spring election in the offing?
Not deliberately, in my view. I think contrive is the right word. They might contrive it, I guess, but I think it would be seen as that.
Yeah.
Accidents happen in minority parliaments. There's been a bit of a history of that in this country, but I think it would be a very risky thing to provoke an election a year in when you have a de facto working majority, I would say, and could get a majority, I guess, through by-elections in the next couple of months. I just see nothing but downside risk, and you don't really need it at this point. And although it's tempting, I guess, because the polls suggest that they're in a dominant position. He is in a dominant position among the leaders by far and away, and they're in a dominant position in places they're not normally in that position. So I'm sure there's a lot of temptation, but I think it would be a foolish thing to do.
Ian?
Well, on the Alberta side, before the election, just before the leadership review vote here at the convention in Calgary, Pierre Poilievre did say he was going to double down on the kind of blue-collar strategy of the Conservative Party to try to attract blue-collar voters. They don't see any particular political leader as the salvation of the country because they're worried about how they're going to pay for next week's grocery bill. But I think we're seeing the fruition of this. I mean, if that's the approach that the Conservatives are going to take, there are obviously blue-collar voters here in Alberta, but if they're going to do that at the risk of repelling upper-income voters, there's lots of upper-income voters in Calgary and in Edmonton, and I think that's seems to be a price that Poilievre's strategy is willing to pay. I was out with a Liberal insider last week, whose name I won't say, but we'd all know. They were plotting five seats in Calgary, so a pickup of net 4. I think that's a bit optimistic if there was an election at the moment, but I don't think that's crazy. An election this spring, of course, would be, I think, not just risky, as Eugene says, but foolhardy for the national interest. We're in a very complicated trade negotiation with the United States. Mr. Carney now has his chief negotiator. We saw that the U.S. Trade Representative was out commenting on this on the margins of another event in Washington this week. It's obvious that the negotiations have begun in some sense, at least in the preliminary discussions. An election now would have the Prime Minister polarizing against Mr. Trump and polarizing against the Americans in a way that would hamstring him in a CUSMA renegotiation after that election if he were to win. It would do permanent damage to the Canadian trade interest with the United States. And while I think some of the more political people around the Prime Minister might want to take advantage of this blip up in the polls, I got to believe that Carney knows well enough that would tie his hands in trade negotiations after the election, and that would be a very difficult hole for him to dig out of on behalf of the
Yeah,
entire
I'm
country.
with you on that. I mean, we've seen attempts to take advantage of a similar mood. I mean, I think in 1965, Lester Pearson tried it. In 2021, I vividly remember Justin Trudeau tried it on the back of what people thought was a reasonable performance during COVID. You know, people don't give politicians something just because he or she want it. And
No,
unless
and
they're,
the most notorious example was in Ontario in 1990,
right, David Peterson, of course.
which resulted in the
But
first and only NDP government in the province of Ontario, and nobody
right.
voted for them. You couldn't find anyone in Ontario that admitted to have voted for them, but they somehow won a majority.
Right. I mean, so strange things happen. To me, it would be a risk, and I don't think Carney's that kind of risk taker. But, you know, undoubtedly, there is some dark skies brewing on many fronts, but on the trade front you mentioned, Ian, you know, we saw the Supreme Court decision last week, which I think many people thought, well, that's it, though, that's Trump's tariff policy gone. But they were holding back a whole bunch of national security investigations they'd already completed with the idea that instead of doing these kind of blanket emergency tariffs, they would do sectoral tariffs based on national security. And many of them are going to impact Canada. And I think Jameson Greer, the trade representative, said we can expect higher tariffs and probably more sectoral tariffs. So how do we see that going? I mean, it seems to me this is all still geared to CUSMA, and that if they wanted to pull out of CUSMA, they would have done already, and they would have made it pretty clear. It seems to me this is all leverage to getting a better deal on CUSMA. What do you think, Jean? Start.
Well, maybe. I'm not sure I quite see it that way. I think it's just Trump is ideologically wedded to tariffs. He sees it as sort of his thing, part of his brand. I guess he believes that they achieve things in negotiations and generally that other policy instruments don't achieve. I read yesterday that the estimate is that the U.S. government will yield $200 billion in revenue from tariffs over the next year. That's not a trivial amount, even in the United States governmental context. I don't know whether it's so much motivated by CUSMA negotiations or just a conviction that tariffs are the way to go. They're his thing. He doesn't like to admit that he's wrong on anything. And I think he said this in the State of the Union even the other night. He was talking again about the merits of tariffs. So I fully expect that he'll continue on that path with Canada and with other countries. That's the way they do things. It's their economic coercion instrument of choice. And I wouldn't expect to see it. But again, I think you're going to see, like we've seen over the last year, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's not as going to be as dramatic sometimes as the rhetoric would suggest.
What do you think, Ian?
I think we sometimes casually assume that Trump's not very smart or he's driven by momentary passions. On the tariff stuff, there's a strategic plan here. Yes, his big Liberation Day tariffs were struck down last week, but he used the year that it took to run that through the court system to prepare for these 150-day tariffs. The 150-day tariffs, even if Congress doesn't extend them past that, will lay the groundwork for the longer-lasting tariff studies that he needs in order to do this on a permanent basis. There is a plan here, and anybody who thinks there's a quick one Supreme Court decision solution and we go back to something else is deluding themselves. There are multiple trade negotiations going on at the same time. We think the most important one is the one with Canada, but of course the Americans have dozens of these going on at the same time. It's clear, I think, that the Mexicans are further advanced in their discussions with the Trump administration than we are for their own political reasons. This may be part of the counter-narcotics operations that are going on in the United States. I don't think we have a very clear picture of how those two relate together, but there's plainly quite a great deal going on against the drug cartels in Mexico. That may be part of the negotiations as well. We're going to be in for a tough slog here. At some point, I expect Mr. Trump is going to give the 6-month notice that he's withdrawing from the USMCA. That will be another pressure tactic. That said, his big challenge is still that he promised relief on cost of living, as in fact, Mr. Carney promised cost of living relief here, as indeed British Labour did in Britain, the French did, everywhere around the world. There's cost of living pressure. At a certain point, if the cost of living presser goes on for, I said with some economists, they're talking about the 2030 and 2034 presidential campaigns being dominated by cost of living issues. If we're still dealing with a cost of living issue in 2034, we're not having elections anymore. I mean, I think that's the evidence of inflation that's this politically punishing around the world, that the most damaging thing to a democratic system of government is persistent high inflation. And if we're still dealing with people worried about groceries and breads, in other countries, we call these bread riots. Here we call them the Alberta Independence Movement, or MAGA Republicans, or something like that. But it's the same basic underlying problem here. If we have a cost of living problem that goes on for 10 years, we've got a democracy problem.
That's true, but we don't have really high inflation, and they don't have really high inflation in the United States either. Their inflation is higher than target from the central bank. It's, I think, around 2.7%. The problem is the price level jumped so much in those year or two after COVID, that doesn't change. So you're getting 2.5, 2.7 on a much higher price level. And unless
the other thing, Gene, is that is not obvious from those numbers is that companies have been, I was speaking to an economist who's saying companies are absorbing those increased costs, and it's reflected in other areas like lower employment. They're just not hiring.
Yeah. Well, that could be. But all I'm saying is it's not even just getting inflation down. Unless you're going to get into deflation, you can't reduce that price level jump that's happened. And that's what's hurting people, right. I think, more than anything. And if you're getting 2.5% inflation, most people in the U.S. are probably not getting 2.5% wage increases every year. So they're losing ground, and they lost a lot of ground in those 2 years after the pandemic, and in Canada as well. And I don't know what politicians can do about that, frankly. I don't think there's anything they can do about it.
Well, talking of what politicians can do, Pierre Poilievre has virtually ceded the ground on trade and perhaps even on defence to this point. But we're speaking just ahead of a speech he's giving on his vision for Canada-US relations in Toronto today, Thursday. He hasn't been to Washington. He hasn't really given a major speech on this issue. He tried to sort of wish it away, I think, during the election. Is there anything he can say or do that gets him in the game here, or does he essentially just hope that Carney fails? Ian?
Well, remember 3 years ago during the Conservative leadership race, Poilievre was way ahead of the curve on identifying cost of housing as a political issue. He called for the firing of Tiff Macklem as the governor of the Bank of Canada during the Conservative leadership race, and that sort of planted his flag very early on this. He was poo-pooed at the time, but in fact, he was way ahead of the curve. On the Canada-US side, he said, I would say, more difficulty getting ahead of the curve. You'll recall that last January, in the run-up to the election campaign, after Mr. Trudeau announced his retirement from politics, Poilievre effectively disappeared from the public agenda for 2 or 3 weeks, had virtually nothing to say, basically nothing to say, and allowed Carney to establish himself as the leader on this issue. So in a sense, this is all catch-up. Poilievre has never been a foreign policy leader. He's not a defense hawk. He reluctantly moved on defense spending commitments before the last election under tremendous pressure from his own caucus. He didn't want to commit to particular defense spending numbers because of the fiscal pressures that he could see in the budget. I understand the thread the needle he was trying to thread. The difficulty on the Canada-US side is he either falls in line behind Mr. Carney's kind of quasi-elbows up, let's distance ourselves from Trump's side, in which case he has no business, or he leaves himself no space to criticize Carney if Carney's strategy falls apart. Or he can take, I would say, a different approach, maybe a more mature and traditional Canadian approach. If we have to get along with the Americans, it's incumbent on the government to do that. What's going on here? The same line that the Liberals took against Mr. Harper, to be honest, when Mr. Harper was critical of Obama canceling the Keystone XL pipeline. But the problem is in the short term, he will just get slaughtered by news media and slaughtered by the Liberals, and he'll be offside of public opinion. Can he make one of those bets where over the course of the year it pays off for him because the issue comes to him? On the Trump piece, it's more difficult to see space for that.
Gene?
I would agree with that. I think he's in a very awkward position with the United States. First of all, it seems to me there's some fraction of his voters that are more or less in line or supportive of the MAGA agenda. And, I guess he doesn't want to lose or shed any of his core base because he can't afford to. So he's got to walk this fine line. And Carney doesn't give him a lot of space. Most Canadians are not in any way supportive of anything of the American agenda or the Trump agenda. And frankly, they're violently hostile to it. I've seen recent polls that show more Canadians see the United States as a greater threat to Canada than China. There's polls. This is an absolute sea change in the last 9 months, and it's shocking. So I really see no space for Mr. Poilievre on Canada-U.S. other than to basically just stick with where the Prime Minister is.
Yeah, I watched an interview with the head of the former head of GCHQ in Britain. He was asked, I think by the Rest is Politics podcast, about stats which showed in Britain the same thing, that the US was seen as a bigger threat than China, and, and he knows of what he speaks, and he says that is just lunacy.
Yes.
Let's quickly whip through a couple of issues. Now, Ian mentioned defence and the size of the fiscal impact, something that you've written on a lot as well, Jean. What did we make of this defence industrial strategy that Carney released last week? Is that a win for him, or could it backfire just because of he obviously needs for it to start paying off so that it starts absorbing some of the massive increase in costs we're about to see? Jean, do you want to start on that?
Sure, it can be a win. I think I've read it carefully. I think it's a very ambitious agenda. We've never seen anything like this in Canada. We see them in other countries. In a way, we're kind of joining the family of mature NATO states with something like this, it seems to me. But I think that the government sees it as, in a way, I think they realize, I hate to use this phrase, but they need a kind of a social license to make these massive investments in defense, because it's going to mean trade-offs in other areas one way or the other at some point in time, either in reduced spending in some areas, higher taxes, or large structural deficits indefinitely. You can't go to 3.5% of GDP without doing those kind of trade-offs. So if they can show they're getting a huge economic payoff in terms of jobs, innovation, productivity over the next few years, it's going to make that trade-off easier, I think, politically. It's going to make it an easier sell, accepting of Canadians. I've referred to it as, there's a defense consensus now, if you look at the public opinion surveys, but I think it's paper thin. If you ask people, they're in support of much greater defense spending, but no one's asking them about the trade-offs. And that's where the rubber really hits the road. And at some point, there has to be a trade-off. So this defense industrial strategy, I think, is designed to convince Canadians over time and show it in the economic statistics, maybe because of the amount of money that's being spent, that you can have a really positive impact on your economy if you get it right. I am not convinced they have the execution function in the public service to deliver on this thing, by the way. I think it's a very ambitious agenda that really doesn't have a lot of support, if any, in the public service or in the Canadian Armed Forces. And so It's great. It's words on a page, which is great. Words on a page are a necessary but not a sufficient condition to get any kind of policy change, especially major policy change. And that's the biggest risk to it that I see. Intransigence, passive-aggressive behavior, backsliding in the deep state in Ottawa.
Yeah, I mean, you've both seen this up close and personally, and the idea that suddenly this new agency, the Defence Investment Agency, wrests all the decision making away from the Department of Defence, from the Department of Public Services, from the Department of Industry, and that everybody cooperates happily with this. I mean, is that likely to happen?
No, but let me sound a note of slight optimism here. All defense procurement works better if the Prime Minister wants it to happen. When Mr. Martin wanted things to happen, they happened. And when Mr. Harper wanted some purchases to go ahead, they went ahead, and they went ahead very quickly. We bought huge strategic lift planes in the space of about 6 months while I was in PMO. Why? Because the Prime Minister wanted it to happen. He was on the same side as the Defense Minister and the Public Works Minister, and lo and behold, the contracts got signed. Now, those were off-the-shelf planes. There was already a production line. I was also in government when we took up work that had happened when Jean was in government, the beginnings of the national shipbuilding policy. We'd made a decision to go ahead with a single service combatant for the Canadian Navy. That was almost 20 years ago, early next year. 2 years from now, we might see the first of those ships roll off the assembly line in Nova Scotia that the government has spent billions of dollars building and then tens of billions of dollars training the
To be
staff to
fair,
do.
they have
On the
produced some
political,
Arctic offshore
for sure.
ships, but none of the
Yeah.
warships.
No, they're low capacity or low capability ships that were supposed to be the practice run for building the complicated ships. I should say also on the political payoff side, despite dumping tens of billions of dollars into the Halifax economy and creating something like 5,000 jobs at the shipyard and its suppliers, the Harper government never won a single seat in the Halifax area as a result of that. And so let's just be careful about how this turns out. There's supposed to be coordination with allies. That's going to add complexity to the problem here. We're hurtling towards a very difficult international environment with the possibility of broader invasions than the ones that we've seen over the course of the past 5 years in Ukraine and elsewhere. If the Prime Minister wants to put his foot to the pedal here and really push this through, I think there's the possibility for progress in the near term. Is that going to generate benefits that will win an election for the Liberal Party over the course of between now and the next federal election? I'm strongly doubtful of that, even though I think it's a good idea for the country.
Let's finish off with Alberta. To me, a major challenge to Carney's agenda is this deal that he struck with Danielle Smith. There was a memorandum of understanding. It was widespread cheering across the land. But Smith's method of operation is essentially stoking grievances with Ottawa. I mean, already it seems to me that they'll be grumbling about the industrial carbon price increase, which was part of that deal. There does not seem to be any great enthusiasm for carbon capture, which was meant to decarbonize any oil that was going to go in a pipeline. Smith is now planning a bunch of plebiscites, most of which are aimed at the feds when it comes to immigration, the appointment of judges and so on. We spoke about this grand bargain a little while ago, and even Ian was relatively optimistic. I'm far less optimistic now, and really the reasoning for that is because I think Smith is intent on wrecking her own deal. Ian, do you want to pick that up?
Well, I want to be careful about she's not. I disagree a little bit about she's stoking grievances. There are serious problems here in Alberta as a result of 10 years of federal policy to try to hold back Alberta's economy.
Hey, I know about grievance culture because we Scots invented it. So
yeah, of course, yes. So let me just put that down. I've got to walk the streets of Calgary after this podcast is over. If I don't say something about that, I'll get heckled on the street. But on the bigger picture here, we're heading towards this, under this agreement, this MOU between Carney and Smith. There's a deadline between now and April 1st for an agreement on what the new industrial carbon price will be to pay for the carbon capture and storage project. If the stories that are circulating around are true, that the price that they're going to settle on is in the neighborhood of $120 a barrel, or $120 a ton of carbon dioxide, that works out to about $20 a barrel. That's just the conversion. I hate it when we express this in dollars per ton. We should express it in dollars per barrel. Taking $20 per barrel out of a long-term price of oil of something like $50 or $70 a barrel makes the expansion of the industry uneconomic overnight. And I think both the federal government and the province are now coming to terms with industry saying, hold on a minute, if you're going to charge us $20 a barrel to pay for a project that might not work even at $120 a ton, you're doing by indirection what the previous government tried to do by direction, is sealing that oil in the ground. And so, Steve McKinnon, the federal transport minister, was here Wednesday at the Chamber of Commerce for a big speech. When he talked about opening up the Port of Vancouver, there was cheers. When he talked about expanding rail access, there was cheers. When he talked about the MOU, there was no applause at all. And he had to stop and say, how come you're not applauding that? Well, it's because I think on mature reflection, the question of leaving open what's that carbon tax going to be is going to the heart of whether the oil export industry is going to serve Canada's economic purposes in the future.
To pick up on that, Ian, if that doesn't happen, then the pipeline doesn't happen.
Well, something's got to break. Something's got to break here, and if the federal government wants the revenue to pay for the debt that Mr. Carney's taking on, they're going to have to do something to make those oil exports economical. And that might be postponing the carbon capture, downsizing the carbon and capture, finding some other way to pay for the carbon capture project. Unless there's some kind of engineering fix here that I that hasn't become public yet, I think those negotiations are becoming more difficult as they get closer and closer to the reality of making sure we can export another 2 million barrels of oil a day.
Last word to you, Gene.
Well, let me take it to a slightly higher level. I think Danielle Smith is stoking grievances, and I think Ian's right, there are grievances there. I think it was Roger Gibbons who once said something like, Albertans are frustrated Canadian nationalists. I think that's very insightful. There's a lot of frustration, but I don't think they're at the point of separation, as some people suggest. I think these plebiscites are a really bad idea, or referenda, or whatever they are, stoking grievances. You know, it's the oldest trick in the book to blame immigrants, the downtrodden, and the federal government for your government's fiscal woes. And that's what seems to me those plebiscites are all aimed at doing. They're going to bring in a huge deficit. It looks like, I think it's this afternoon, is the Alberta budget. I was reading this morning, they think it's going to be about $1 billion more than they forecast a few months ago. That's largely due to soft oil prices, I think, as Ian was alluding to. Yeah, there's some population pressure dimension to it from immigration, but a lot of it's internal immigration across Canada, which Alberta can do nothing about and the federal government can't do anything about. We have an internally mobile labor market under the Constitution. So I think these are really frivolous, grievance-stoking things that she's planning to do with these referenda. It's not helpful, and I hope the frustrated Canadian nationalists in Alberta see that for what it is.
Well, fortunately, neither you or I have to walk the streets of Calgary after this, Gene, so
No.
but I'm in full agreement with you on that. Gentlemen, thank you very much again. It's always a pleasure.
Good to see you guys.
Good to see you both.
Let's get the band on the road, eh?